Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Reading Rainbows, where we're reading Inkspell by Cornelia Funke. And today we are reading Chapter 4, Silvertongue's Daughter. Was there only one world, after all, which spent its time dreaming of others? Philip Pullman, The Subtle Knife. Maggie hated quarreling with Mo. It left her shaking inside, and nothing could comfort her. Not a hug from her mother, not the licorice candies Reese's Aunt Eleanor gave her if their loud voices had carried to the library, not Darius, who firmly believed in the miraculous healing powers of hot milk and honey in such cases. Nothing helped. It's always frustrating, when you fight with your parents or, as a parent, arguing with your children. It's always frustrating because you both think you're right. You both only want to see things from your perspective, and it's so hard to see it from the other person's perspective. As parents, we think that, we're older, we know better, and as kids, it's just like, I want to live my life. I have my own thoughts and opinions. Why won't you listen to me? This time, it had been particularly bad because Mo had really only come to see her to say goodbye. He had a new job waiting, some sick books too old and valuable to be sent to him. In the past, Maggie would have gone with him, but this time she had decided to stay with Eleanor and her mother. Why did he have to come to her room just when she was reading the notebooks again? They'd often quarreled over those notebooks recently, although Mo hated a quarrel as much as she did. After all, he usually disappeared into the workshop that Eleanor had built behind the house for him, and a time would come, once Maggie couldn't bear to be angry with him anymore, when she would follow him there. He never raised his head when she slipped through the doorway, and without a word Maggie would sit down beside him on the chair that was always ready for her, and watch him at work, just as she had done even before she could read. She loved watching his hands free a book from its shabby dress, separate stained pages from each other, part the threads holding together a damaged quire, or soak rag paper to mend a sheet of paper worn thin. It was never long before Mo turned and asked her a question of some kind. Did she like the color he'd chosen for a linen binding? Did she agree on the paper pulp he'd mixed for repairs had turned out slightly too dark? It was Mo's way of apologizing, of saying, "Don't let's quarrel, Maggie. Let's forget what we said just now." But that was no good today, because he hadn't disappeared into his workshop. He'd gone away to see some book collector or other and give the collector's printed treasures a new lease on life. This time he wouldn't come to her with a present to make up for the quarrel, a book he'd found in a second-hand bookshop somewhere, or a bookmark decorated with blue jay feathers found in Eleanor's garden. So why couldn't she have been reading some other book when he came into her room? In a way, it's kind of sweet how, they have their arguments, they separate to cool down a little bit, and then, they just have to sort of slip into each other's room or whatever and just, sort of quietly be together and accept that as, an apology and forgiveness. But on the other hand, all that does is delay actually talking about whatever they were arguing about, because you need to actually have these discussions without screaming. Just ignoring the issue does no good. "Good heavens, Maggie, you seem to have nothing in your head but those notebooks," he had said angrily. It had been the same every time these last few months, whenever he had found her like that in her room, lying on the rug, deaf and blind to all that went on around her, eyes glued to the words with which she had written down what Reese had told her, tales of what she had seen there, as Mo so bitterly called it. There. Inkworld was the name Maggie gave to the place of which Mo spoke so slightingly, and her mother sometimes with such longing. Inkworld, after the book about it, Inkheart. The book was gone, but her mother's memories were as vivid as if not a day had passed since she was there. In that world of paper and printer's ink, where there were fairies and princes, water nymphs, fire elves, and trees that seemed to grow to the sky. Maggie had sat with her mother for countless days and nights, writing down what Risa's fingers told her. Risa had left her voice behind in the Inkworld, so she talked to her daughter either with pencil and paper or with her hands, telling the story of those years. Those terrible magical years, she called them. Sometimes she also drew what her eyes had seen, but her tongue could no longer describe. Fairies, birds, strange flowers, conjured up on paper with just a few strokes, yet looking so real that Maggie almost believed she had seen them too. At first, Mo himself had bound the notebooks in which Maggie wrote down Risa's memories, and each binding was more beautiful than the last. But a time came when Maggie noticed the anxiety in his eyes as he watched her reading them, completely absorbed in the words and pictures. Of course, she understood his uneasiness. After all, for years he'd lost his wife to that world made of words and paper. How could he like it if his daughter thought of little else? Oh yes, Maggie understood Mo very well, yet she couldn't do as he asked, close the books and forget the Inkworld for a while. Yeah, and this is a very tough spot to be in, because Mo's got his fears and distaste at this point of the Inkworld. Like they were saying, Risa had been lost to that world for so long, and he just recently got her back. And, she speaks of it lovingly. She says that it's horrifying but still so beautiful. And then you've got Maggie, who's just so enamored with it that, at this point, she seems almost as obsessed with it as Dustfinger had been. And, he's afraid that she's going to now try to figure out some way to make herself disappear into that world, the world that he just got his wife back from. Perhaps her longing for it wouldn't have been quite as strong if the fairies and brownies had still been around. All those strange creatures they had brought back from Capricorn's accursed village, but none of them lived in Eleanor's garden now. The fairies' empty nests still clung to the trees, and the burrows that the brownies had dug were still there, but their inhabitants were gone. At first Eleanor thought they had run away or been stolen, but then the ashes had been found. They covered the grass in the garden, fine as dust, gray ashes as gray as the shadows from which Eleanor's strange guests had once appeared. And Maggie had realized that there was no return from death, even for creatures made of nothing but words. Eleanor, however, could not reconcile herself to this idea. Defiantly, desperately, she had driven back to Capricorn's village, only to find the streets empty, the houses burned down, and not a living soul in sight. Eleanor, Mo had said when she came back with her face tear-stained, I was afraid of something like this. I couldn't really believe there were words to bring back the dead. And besides, if you're honest with yourself, you must admit they didn't fit into this world. Nor do I, was all Eleanor had replied. Over the next few weeks, Maggie often heard sobbing from Eleanor's room when she slipped into the library one last time in the evening to find a book. Many months had passed since then. They had all been living together in Eleanor's big house for nearly a year, and Maggie had a feeling that Eleanor was glad not to be alone with her books any more. She had given them the best rooms. Eleanor's old school books and a few writers she no longer much liked had been banished to the attic to make more space. Maggie's room had a view of snow-topped mountains, and from her parents' bedroom you could see the distant lake with its gleaming water, which had so often tempted the fairies to fly in that direction. Mo had never simply gone off like that before, without a word of goodbye, without making up the quarrel. Perhaps I should go down and help Darius in the library, thought Meggie as she sat there wiping the tears from her face. She never cried while she was quarreling with Mo. The tears didn't come until later. And he always looked terribly guilty when he saw her red eyes. She was sure that yet again everyone had heard them quarreling. Darius was probably making the hot milk and honey already, and as soon as she put her head around the kitchen door, Eleanor would begin calling Mo and men in general names. No, she'd better stay in her own room. I just want to know what names in general Eleanor is calling Mo and, just men in general. What names exactly is she calling them, and are they names appropriate for a 13-year-old to be hearing? Probably not. Oh, Mo. He'd snatched the notebook she was reading out of her hand and taken it with him. And that one was the book where she'd collected ideas for stories of her own, beginnings that had never gotten any further, opening words, crossed-out sentences, all her failed attempts. How could he just take it away from her? She didn't want Mo to read it. She didn't want him seeing how she tried in vain to fit the words together on paper, words that came to her tongue so easily and with such power when she read aloud. Meggie could write down what Risa described to her. She could fill pages and pages with the stories her mother told her. But as soon as she tried to make something new of them, a story with a life of its own, her mind went blank. The words seemed to fly out of her head, like snowflakes leaving only a damp patch on your skin when you put out your hand to catch them. Someone knocked on Maggie's door. "Come in," she snuffled, looking in her trouser pockets for one of the old-fashioned handkerchiefs that Eleanor had given her. "They belong to my sister. Her name began with an M like yours, embroidered in the corner. There, see? I thought it would be better for you to have them than let the moths eat holes in them." Her mother put her head around the door. Maggie tried to smile, but it was a miserable failure. "Can I come in?" Risa's fingers traced the words in the air faster than Darius could have said them aloud. Maggie nodded. By now she understood her mother's sign language almost as easily as the letters of the alphabet. She knew it better than Mo, and much better than Eleanor, who often called for Maggie in desperation when Risa's fingers went too fast for her. Risa closed the door behind her and sat down on the windowsill with her daughter. Maggie always called her mother by her first name, perhaps because she hadn't had a mother for 10 years, or perhaps because, for the same inexplicable reason, she had always called her father just Mo. Maggie recognized the notebook as soon as Risa put it on her lap. It was the one that Mo had taken. "I found it lying outside your door," said her mother's hands. Maggie stroked the patterned binding. So Mo had brought it back. Why hadn't he come in? Because he was still too angry? Or because he was sorry? And this is why I say that you need to talk to each other. You need to communicate. "He wants me to put them away in the attic, at least for a while." Mo suddenly felt so small, and at the same time so old. He said, "Perhaps I ought to turn into a glass man or dye my skin blue, since my wife and daughter obviously think more of fairies and glass men than of me." Risa smiled and stroked Maggie's nose with her forefinger. "Yes, I know of course he doesn't really think that, but he always gets so angry when he sees me with the notebooks." Risa looked out through the open window. Eleanor's garden was so large that you couldn't see where it began or ended. You just saw tall trees and rhododendron shrubs so old that they surrounded Eleanor's house like an evergreen wood. Right under Maggie's window was a lawn with a narrow gravel path around it. A garden seat stood to one side of the lawn. Maggie still remembered the night when she had sat there watching Dustfinger breathe fire. Eleanor's ever-grumpy gardener had swept the dead leaves off the lawn only that afternoon. You could still see the bare patch in the middle, where Capricorn's men had burned Eleanor's best books. The gardener kept trying to persuade Eleanor to plant something in that space, or sow more grass seed there, but Eleanor just shook her head energetically. "Who grows grass on a grave?" she had snapped the last time he had suggested it. "Well, I've been to plenty of cemeteries where there's grass growing over the graves, so I don't know what Eleanor's talking about." And she told him to leave the yarrow alone too. It had grown luxuriantly around the sides of the blackened patch ever since the fire, as if to make its flat flower heads a reminder of the night when Eleanor's printed children were swallowed up by the flames. The sun was setting behind the nearby mountains, so red that it was as if it too wanted to remind them of that long-extinguished fire, and a cool wind blew from the hills, making Risa shiver. Maggie closed the window. The wind blew a few faded rose petals across the pane. They stuck to the glass, pale yellow and translucent. "I don't want to quarrel with him," she whispered. "I never used to quarrel with Mo. Well, almost never." Perhaps he's right. Her mother pushed back her hair. It was just as long as Maggie's, but darker, as if a shadow had fallen on it. Risa usually held it back with combs. Maggie often wore her hair like that too, and sometimes, when she looked at her reflection in the mirror of her wardrobe, she seemed to be seeing not herself, but a younger version of her mother. "Another year and she'll be towering over you," Mo sometimes said when he wanted to tease Risa, and the short-sighted Darius had confused Maggie with her mother several times already. Risa ran her forefinger over the window pane as if tracing the rose petals that clung to it. Then her hands began speaking again, hesitantly, just as lips can sometimes hesitate. "I do understand your father, Maggie," she said. "Sometimes I myself think the two of us talk about that other world too often. Even I don't understand why I keep coming back to the subject, and I'm always telling you about what was beautiful there, not the other things. Being shut up, Mortola's punishments, how my hands and knees hurt so much from all the work that I couldn't sleep, all the cruelty I saw there. Did I tell you about the maid who died of fright because a nightmare stole into our bedroom?" Okay, what is a nightmare? The way they've got it written here makes me think of a horse. But, is it like some sort of a skeletal horse, similar to a thestral? Or is it something else entirely? "Yes, you did." Maggie moved very close to her mother, but Risa's hands fell silent. They were still roughened from all the years of toil as a maid, working first for Mortola and then for Capricorn. "You've told me about everything," said Maggie. "The bad things too, even if Mo won't believe it." "Because all the same he feels that we dream only of the wonderful part. As if I ever had much of that." Risa shook her head. Again her fingers fell silent for a long time before she let them go on. "I had to steal it for myself in seconds, minutes, sometimes a precious hour when we were allowed out in the forest to gather the plants Mortola needed for her black potions. But there were the years when you were free, too, when you disguised yourself and worked in the market as a scribe." Disguised as a man. Maggie had pictured it over and over again. Her mother, with her hair cut short, wearing a scribe's tunic, ink on her fingers from the finest handwriting to be found in the Inkworld. So Risa had told her. It was the way she had earned a living in a world that didn't make it easy for women to work. Maggie would have liked to hear the story again now, even if it had a sad ending, for after that Risa's years of unhappiness had begun. But wonderful things had happened during that time, too, like the great banquet at the Laughing Prince's castle to which Mortola had taken her maids, the banquet where Risa saw the Laughing Prince himself, and the Black Prince and his bear, the tightrope walker called Cloud Dancer. But Risa hadn't come into her room to tell all these stories again. She said nothing in reply, and when her fingers did begin to speak once more, they moved more slowly than usual. "Forget the Inkworld, Meggie," they said. "Let's both of us forget it, at least for a little while, for your father's sake, and for yours. Or one day you may be blind to the beauty around you here." She looked out of the window again at the gathering dusk. "I've told you all about it already," said her hands. "Everything you wanted to know." So she had, and Meggie had asked her many questions, thousands and thousands of them. Did you ever see one of the giants? What sort of clothes did you wear? What did the fortress look like in the forest where Mortola took you? And that prince you talk about, the Laughing Prince, was his castle as huge and magnificent as the Castle of Night? Tell me about his son, Cosimo the Fair, and the Adderhead and his men-at-arms. Was everything in his castle really made of silver? How big is the bear that the Black Prince always keeps beside him? And what about the trees? Can they really talk? And that old woman, the one they all call Nettle, is it true that she can fly?" Yeah, this sounds like me, if I was presented with someone who, had visited the world of another book. Yeah, I'd probably be asking 1,000,001 questions myself, because, I love losing myself into books, and I love knowing all the little teeny tiny fine details. Risa had answered all these questions as well as she could, but even 1,000 answers did not add up as a whole to 10 years. And there were some questions that Meggie had never put to her. She had never asked about Dustfinger, for instance, but Risa had talked about him all the same, telling her that everyone in the Inkworld knew his name, even many years after he had disappeared. Of course, he was known as the Fire Dancer, too, so Risa had recognized him at once when she met him for the first time in this world. There was another question that Meggie didn't ask, although it often came into her mind, for Risa couldn't have answered it. What about Finoglio, the writer of the book that had drawn first her mother and finally even its own author into its pages? How was Finoglio now? More than a year had passed since Meggie's voice had cast the spell of Finoglio's own words over him, and he had disappeared as if they had swallowed him up. Sometimes Meggie saw his wrinkled face in her dreams, but she never knew if it looked sad or happy. Not that it had ever been easy to read the expression on Finoglio's tortoise-like face anyway. One night, when she woke suddenly from one of these dreams and couldn't get to sleep again, she had begun a story in which Finoglio was trying to write himself home again, back to his grandchildren and the village where Meggie had first met him. But as with all the other stories she'd started to write, she never got past the first 3 sentences. Meggie leafed through the notebook that Mo had taken away from her, then closed it again. Risa put a hand under her chin and looked into her face. "Don't be cross with him." "I never am, not for long. He knows that. How much longer will he be away?" 10 days, maybe more." 10 days? Meggie looked at the shelf beside her bed. There they were, neatly arranged side by side, the bad books, as she secretly called them, full of Risa's stories. Tales of glass men and water nymphs, fire elves, nightmares, white women, and all the other strange creatures that her mother had described. "All right, I'll phone him and say that he can make them a box, but I'll keep the key to it." Risa dropped a kiss on her forehead. Then she carefully passed her hand over the notebook in Meggie's lap. "Does anyone in the world bind books more beautifully than your father?" her fingers asked. Meggie shook her head with a smile. "No," she whispered. "No one in this world or any other." When Risa went downstairs again to help Darius and Eleanor with supper, Meggie stayed by the window to watch Eleanor's garden filling with shadows. When a squirrel scurried over the lawn, its bushy tail stretched out behind it, she was reminded of Dustfinger's tame marten, Gwyn. How strange that she now understood the yearning she had so often seen on his master's scarred face. Like I'm saying, she's about as obsessed with the Inkworld as Dustfinger was. Yes, Mo was probably right. She thought about Dustfinger's world too much, far too much. She had even read some of Reese's stories aloud a few times, although she didn't know how dangerous her voice could be when it spoke the word. Although didn't she know how dangerous her voice could be when it spoke the words on the page? Hadn't she, to be perfectly honest, more honest than people usually are, hadn't she cherished the secret hope that the words would take her to that world? What would Mo have done if he'd known about those experiments? Would he have buried the notebooks in the garden or thrown them into the lake, as he sometimes threatened to do with the stray cats that stole into his workshop? Yes, I'll lock them away, thought Meggie, as the first stars appeared outside, as soon as Mo has made them a new box. The box with her favorite books in it was crammed full now. It was red as poppies. Mo had only recently repainted it. The box for the notebooks must be a different color, perhaps green like the wayless wood that Risa had described so often. Yes, green. And didn't the guards outside the Laughing Prince's castle wear green cloaks, too? A moth fluttered against the window, reminding Meggie of the blue-skinned fairies and the best of all the stories that Risa had told her about them, how they healed Dustfinger's face after Basta had slashed it, in gratitude to him for the many times he had freed their sisters from the wire cages where peddlers imprisoned them to be sold at markets as good luck charms. And deep in the wayless wood No, that's enough. Meggie leaned her forehead against the cool pane. Quite enough. I'll take them all to Mo's workshop, she thought, at once, and when he's back I'll ask him to bind me a new notebook for stories about this world of ours. She had already begun writing some, about Eleanor's garden and her library, about the castle down by the lake. Robbers had once lived there. Eleanor had told her about them in her own typical storytelling style, with so many grisly details that Darius, listening, forgot to go on sorting books, and his eyes widened in horror behind his thick glasses. I love that, Eleanor tells these stories full of, grisly details, and Maggie's probably going, yeah, tell me more, and Darius is like, oh, that's horrible! Meggie, supper time! Eleanor's call echoed right to the top of the stairs. She had a very powerful voice, louder than the Titanic's foghorn, Mo always said. Meggie slipped off the windowsill. Coming, she called down the corridor. Then she went back into her room, took the notebooks off the shelf one by one, until her arms could hardly hold the stack, and carried the precarious pile down the corridor and into the room that Mo used as an office. It had once been Maggie's bedroom. She had slept there when she first came to Eleanor's house with Mo and Dustfinger, but all you could see from its window was the gravel forecourt, some spruce trees, a large chestnut, and Eleanor's gray station wagon, which stood outside in all weather, because it was Eleanor's opinion that cars living in luxury in a garage rusted more quickly. That doesn't make any sense. But when they had decided to come and live there, Meggie had wanted a window with a view of the garden. So Mo, surrounded by Eleanor's collection of old travel guides, did his paperwork in the room where Meggie had slept before she ever went to Capricorn's village, when she still had no mother and almost never quarreled with Mo. Meggie, where are you? Eleanor's voice sounded impatient. Her joints often ached these days, but she refused to go to the doctor. What's the point? Was her only comment. They haven't invented a pill to cure old age, have they? I'll be down in a minute, called Meggie, carefully lowering the notebooks onto Mo's desk. Two of them slipped off the pile and almost knocked over the vase of autumn flowers that her mother had put by the window. Meggie caught it just before the water spilled over Mo's invoices and receipts for gasoline. She was standing there with the vase still in her hand. her fingers sticky with drifting pollen, when she saw the figure between the trees where the path came up from the road. Her heart began to thud so hard that the vase almost slipped out of her fingers again. Well, that just went to prove it. Mo was right. Maggie, take your head out of those books or soon you won't know the difference between reality and your imagination. He told her that so often, and now it was happening. She'd been thinking about Dustfinger only a moment ago, hadn't she? And now she saw someone standing out there in the night, just like the time, more than a year ago, when she'd seen Dustfinger waiting outside their house, motionless as the figure she saw there at this moment. Who's out there? 'Cause we know it can't be Dustfinger. Maggie, for heaven's sake, how many more times do I have to call you? Eleanor was wheezing from climbing all the stairs. What are you doing standing there rooted to the spot? Didn't you say... Good heavens, who's that? You can see him too? Maggie was so relieved she could have hugged Eleanor. Well, of course I can. The figure moved. Barefoot it ran over the pale gravel. It's that boy! Eleanor sounded incredulous. The one who helped the matchstick eater steal the book from your father. Well, he's got nerve turning up here. He looks somewhat worse for wear. Does he think I'm going to let him in? I dare say the matchstick eater's out there too. Eleanor came closer to the window, looking anxious, but Maggie was already out the door. She ran downstairs and raced through the entrance hall. Her mother came along the corridor leading to the kitchen. Risa! Maggie called. Farid's here! It's Farid! And that's the end of that chapter. So, Maggie's obsessed with the Inkworld. Mo hates that Maggie's obsessed with the Inkworld. Risa's caught between a rock and a hard place because she wants to, share these stories with Maggie. Because, it's something that happened to her. She wants to share that. But, that then makes Mo think that she wishes she was back there, even if that's not necessarily true. And now Farid is back, and he's going to tell them that, Dustfinger's been sent back to Inkworld, and he wants to go back too. And, well, it's all gonna be interesting. Can't wait to see what happens next. I hope you'll join me next time, and I hope you have a great day.